Good morning. It's a real treat to be here today. Arrived in Santiago on Thursday and presented the report that I see many of you have, first at the Ministry of Education, and yesterday we had a presentation at the beautiful old Senate building. If you don't know it, it's actually, for me, it was really nice to see it. But today, this is the real thing, because I have a chance to meet and talk with ones that really make a difference in terms of English teaching and English language learning in Chile. So I hope this is going to be a useful conversation. So as Claudio was saying, I'm an economist. And an economist, I don't teach English. I don't know how to teach English. I learn English and I speak English. And I actually don't even do research about teaching. I work on public policy. And the question is, what's the motivation for an economist that comes from, a rather traditional background, focusing on public policies, to be focusing on English language learning? And the motivation is actually quite simple. What a lot of studies show is that the education system needs to respond more effectively to the changing demands that come from the job market. Okay. That our economies are integrating to the world. Technology is changing. The way we work has changed over time. And so there's something that we're now calling skills for the 21st century, which is sort of a symbol that captures all the things that we see young people need to learn while they're in school so that they have an easier transition into the job market, and then they can really learn to learn while they are working. And all the surveys that have been done internationally, business surveys, indicate that being fluent in a second language, and in particular in English, is now one of the primary skills for the 21st century. And that basic motivation, and a lot of conversations with not only policymakers, but actually business people across Latin America, convinced us that this was a major issue. But then the next question is, are governments in Latin America doing the right thing so that everyone has an opportunity to learn English? And I emphasize the word all, because we know that our societies are highly unequal societies, that our schooling system often struggles not to reproduce those inequalities. And so the question is really whether there are policies and programs in place that will allow those children, young people that otherwise would not have an opportunity to learn English to do so. And that's really what is behind the effort that got expressed in this report. Understanding to what extent public policies in Latin America are adequate to respond to the challenge of giving opportunities for all to learn English. And there's really, when you think about it, there's really two big things that governments can do. They can set the right policy framework, that is, the big orientations that will then guide the education system. And the second thing they can do is to create, develop, and implement programs for the actual teaching of English. So let's talk a little bit about each of these. And the report is a regional report. We covered 10 countries in Latin America. Together, they represent 85% of the population. So it's a pretty good representation of the region. So I will try to give you a regional perspective and highlight as much as I can the results or the findings for Chile. Okay, so I'll make an effort at bringing it down to the reality that you guys face here in your country. So in terms of assessing public policies, we've looked at a number of dimensions. They have to do with, start with the most basic thing, which is English teaching mandatory in school or not? Then we move on to somewhat more complex issues like, is there a national strategy, and is that strategy does it have goals and objectives? Are there standards? Are there learning standards? Are there metrics that have been defined for those standards and goals? Are there standards for teaching, for teachers? And are all these things actually being measured? Okay. So we go one by one, and we reviewed where the various countries are in each of these dimensions, and we gave them a note. Actually, there's three. There's a check mark, there's an X, and a little box in the middle. So it's a report card. Now, what's the overall finding? Finding is that we do see that countries in Latin America, at least the 10 that we looked at, have made significant progress in really developing a policy framework for English language learning. So English language learning is today mandatory in a majority of these countries. In the ones that it's not mandatory, it's teaching a foreign language is, and English is one of the languages there is being taught. So overall, we see that's a good example of how indeed countries, governments in Latin America are recognizing that this is indeed an important topic and that it deserves their attention. You can look at the table and you'll see the variations. I won't get into all of the details there, but I want to mention some big features that jump to the eye. And the most important one is that the weakest of all the policy dimensions that we look at has to do with measurement. Okay. And by measurement, I mean the measurement of learning and knowledge by students, as well as the proficiency of those that teach English. And there what we see is that in a majority of countries, these are weak categories. What it means is that in many countries, nobody can tell whether the students in school are learning English, nor can they tell whether those that are teaching English actually have the proficiency needed to do so. The information does not exist. This clearly is a major handicap. Right? It's very hard. So, if you don't have information on the results, the learning, is very hard to run a system. Now, the other fact that jumps to the eye is that Chile compares very positively to the rest of the countries. Essentially has a check mark in every single category, which is good news. I think, you should feel free. Certainly the people that we talk to on Thursday and Friday feel very proud of achievements. And when we compare with my own country, Argentina, the contrast is quite sharp in terms of you look at the grades that Chile and Argentina are getting. There's a big difference there. Now, does that mean that there are no challenges at this, big policy level? That is, that Chile doesn't need to deal at all with further definitions and regulations? The answer is no. Unfortunately, it doesn't matter how good you do. There's always the opportunity to do a little bit better. And there's a number of things that are what I would call second generation policy issues. Some have to do with refining the existing policy framework. For example, standards. Okay. Right now in Chile, the expectation, the standard is that students will graduate with a B1, right? Using the common European framework of reference. Should that remain the standard or not? Uruguay, for example, has a B2 standard. Is that, should that be the standard or not? I honestly don't have the answer to that. But one would expect that over time, this is going to be something that will need to be discussed and perhaps reviewed. So that's one example. We had also, both on Thursday and Friday, some debate as to whether, starting at which grade should English be mandatory. Okay, so Chile, it's fifth grade. Is that the right choice or not? And there's different opinions. So again, I don't have a very strong view on the subject, but it's something that one would expect may come up over time as sort of a refinement of the policy framework. But there are some beyond this refinement of the existing policy framework. I think there are some areas that we didn't measure that are actually quite important. And I'll mention two. The first one is English teaching at the higher education level. Should it be mandatory? Should there be standards? Now, Chile doesn't have those. Colombia does. Just offering a contrast. I personally think that this is a major area where a major weakness, I would say, when there's basically no regulation whatsoever on what happens at the higher education level. So that's one area. The second one has to do with what we in the report call academies, which is this range of institutions that offer English classes that are not part of the regular education system. And this is actually quite significant in many countries in terms of the number of students they reach. And in every single country that we looked at, there's essentially no quality assurance system that applies to those institutions. Okay? So there are no regulations, there are no standards. So when you think about it as a consumer of those services, you're essentially left to your own devices to try to figure out which one is a good academy and which one is not. I do think that, again, this is an area of weakness, not just in Chile, but across the region. Clearly, you don't want to over-regulate to make it impossible for these institutions to work. But you need to think about how you do it. You do it through some form of accreditation. You do it through accreditation of teachers or the institutions. Or do you move towards more of a lighter form of regulation that is more self-regulation? Okay, that is the industry itself defines, with some help from government, their own standards and criteria. Anyway, this is just to give you a sense that when it comes to setting the right incentives through the policy framework, the messages are Latin America is moving in the right direction. There is diversity across countries. Chile seems to be in sort of the top range in terms of that diversity. The weakest areas have to do with measurement. And, but even for a country like Chile that is better than the rest, there are some areas that deserve further attention. So I don't expect the discussions and the debate on the English language learning policy framework in Chile to disappear, okay, to be sort of a foregone conclusion. I think that over the future, the next few years, there's likely to be continued discussion on these issues. Let me, before I move on to this second area dealing with programs, let me emphasize again the question of measurement. And this goes beyond measuring outcomes, which is a very essential issue. And the contrast between the effort in Latin America to measure learning outcomes in the traditional areas, Spanish, math, science, and non-traditional areas like English is quite sharp. Because today, practically every country in Latin America has a regular national assessment system, okay, that covers Spanish, math, science. We don't see the same for English, and that's a major gap. But as I said, the problem in terms of data and information goes well beyond learning outcomes. If we want to know how many children in grade, whatever, say 6, are actually learning, taking, say, English classes, and how many hours a week of classes they're getting, that information is not readily available. And it's typically not simply that it's not readily available for a researcher, for someone trying to study the issue. The ministry itself doesn't know. Okay. teachers. How many English language teachers do you think there are in Chile?
14,000.
14,000. Any other number? It's more like 8,000. But Chile is an exception in the sense that the data exists. There is actually, the ministry collects that information. Whether it's accurate or not, it's a different discussion, but the data exists. And we're presenting this report, and we had the head of the English language program from Uruguay, and she was asked several times, and she said, well, we don't know. Okay, we don't collect that information. So there is basic deficiency in systems, education systems that are not collecting the basic data. So anyway, moving on, as I said, two ways of intervening and creating the conditions for everyone to learn English, the big policy framework, and then programs. And when it comes to programs, the picture is even more diverse than when it comes to policies. Chile and Uruguay, I think, are in the forefront of the region. Chile, with the PIAP, there was really a pioneer program when it started. It is clearly, an example for the region. Uruguay, through Ceibal in Inglés, is another interesting example, and I will say a few things about them. There are a number of countries that now are making progress in developing a national program. Colombia bilingüe, Panama bilingüe, Peruvian program, I always mix up their title, but it's Inglés Puertas al Mundo, I think. It's a version of the Chilean version. So countries are moving in the direction of developing a national flagship program, and I would say very much inspired by the experience of Chile, that you do need a flagship program. So it seems that while there is a lot more diversity, there are many countries in which there aren't any national programs, and countries in which the national program is still in its infancy. The overall direction is in terms of having a national flagship program. One of the key issues with these programs is sustainability and continuity. So what we've seen in good cases, for example, Mexico. Mexico has had English language learning programs, but they haven't been sustained. They've been unstable. Okay, there's now a new wave. The ministry, the Secretaría de Educación Pública, just issued a new set of policies, and there's a new program, so we'll have to see how it goes. But continuity is a key issue. Why? Because really what you're talking about is a big transformation, right? And unless you're able to sustain it over time, the effort is unlikely to yield results. Now, where is the key bottleneck for these programs to to really make a difference and work? Well, not surprisingly, goes back to people, is having enough well-prepared and well-supported teachers. And that has become really the key bottleneck for scaling up English language learning in Latin America. Having the sufficient number of well-qualified, trained, and supported teachers, English language teachers. The general sense, and again using an economic metaphor, we see is that the problem today is not with the demand for English, but with the supply, right? So families, governments really see the importance of kids having the opportunity to learn English. It's just that the ability to actually do it at scale is still limited. And the binding constraint there is having sufficient number of good teachers. Just to give you an example, I mean, it's an outrageous number, but the Mexicans say that they need 85,000 more teachers, English language teachers. I don't think they're going to find them anytime soon. One of the key issues then, when you start thinking about how you deal with this problem of human resources, so the first issue is how many students study to become an English teacher, how many graduate, and how good is their training. That's the number one issue. Now, what's the reality there in Latin America? That the regulatory framework, the quality assurance framework, under which the teaching institutions operate is rather weak. This is not specific to English, right? In general, it's a sector that is quite autonomous, and a lot of governments struggle in their ability to actually bring some control over not only the number of institutions, but particularly their quality. Once again, here Chile is a good example, because over the last several years, there's been really a consistent effort at accreditation of English language teaching programs at the higher education level. And there's been, you can see in terms of the number in the report, we have the data there coming from the ministry in terms of how many of these institutions are being accredited. That's a very important trend, but it's not the norm. It's more the exception than the norm. Okay. So here already there is sort of a big challenge that has to do with taking those standards that have been established by law and actually being able to create the conditions to enforce them. Okay, so that those that actually graduate with a degree meet those standards and then ready to be hired and teach. But that's only the beginning, right? We know that then once you're hired as a teacher, you do need the support that that will help you mature as a teacher, learn, develop, And here there's two big issues. One is professional development programs, and the other one has to do more with, let's call them networks or more informal ways of providing support to teachers. The professional development angle is a very interesting one, because what we see is that many countries are actually investing quite a bit of resources on that. And they're following different strategies. Two big ones have to do with the choice between doing it domestically versus doing it abroad. So, for example, Panama has made a very radical choice to actually train their teachers, in-service teachers, to become better English teachers abroad. And last time I checked, I think they had sent abroad about 2,000 teachers. It's very costly. Now, it may be a great investment depending on the results, right? And maybe a good investment if when they come back, they actually go into teaching, right? Into teaching and the public schools. If they don't, then it's a bad, even if they learn, it may be a bad investment. How do we assess? How can we tell what is the right approach to professional development? Well, we need more evaluations, right? You need to actually be able to measure how much learning and improvement in proficiency and in teaching techniques occurs as a result of those programs. And you need also to look very carefully at their cost, right? Because you want really resources are limited, and so you really want to find the right combination, right, of how much money you put and how much you get. Unfortunately, we don't have that information. There is really a scarcity of good impact evaluations of teacher professional development programs. So our sense is that faced with the pressure to do things, which is a real pressure. Many governments are innovating and creating things, very well intentioned, but they are essentially operating in an empirical vacuum, right? Where they don't know whether what they're doing is the right thing, and more seriously, they may never learn whether they were the right thing or not because they haven't set up a good evaluation framework. So I think this is a critical area. The other one that I mentioned was networks. And we've been having a little bit, I've been hearing the last 2 days a little bit about networks here in Chile. This is an issue in general, not just for English language teachers, but more generally. But given the specificities and the relative newness of this sort of a corps of teachers in most countries, the challenge of actually finding these more horizontal connections is an important one. right? And clearly, TESOL plays some of that role, but it's not enough. There's another angle to the networking aspect, which is slightly less horizontal, but it has to do with the whole supervision system and support system to teachers. And this, by the way, will become a major issue in Chile once the desmunicipalización takes place, because there's going to be a new institutional framework, okay? And so thinking through how that would operate and serve those of you that are teaching English, I think will be an important issue to discuss. Now, all of this, whether it's about initial teacher training, professional development, support structures, it still keeps us in a rather traditional road. These are fundamental things that need to happen, right? And they take time. And the sooner you start, the better, because it's not something that will happen or will yield results overnight or even in a couple of years. It's really more of a decade-long process. But it still, as I said, keeps us in traditional territory. And this challenges us to think of sort of other ways of getting to the problem of enhancing the teaching through enhancing the human part of the endeavor. And there's a number of things that are already happening on that front. First one has to do with importing, to use another sort of economic term, important teaching resources. One example of that is the whole effort to bring volunteers, foreign volunteers, into the education system, okay, into the classroom. And Chile has a program. There's a few other countries that have, but I believe that Chile's is probably the largest one. I believe that there's great potential in those programs, and this is not a substitute for domestic teachers, but it's a complement. And if well done, it can actually yield interesting results. What I can tell you from looking at it from the point of view of the US, where I live, the interest among college graduates in the US to spend time in Latin America teaching English is just tremendous. Okay, so there is a big supply there that needs to be channeled the right way. My daughter, when she graduated from college, she had two choices. She was thinking about two options. It was either come to Latin America. She had spent several years spending time in rural areas in Honduras. So one choice was to actually go and teach English in Latin America. The other one was go and start to become a social worker, which she did. Anyway, but it's a popular option. Now, the second one is bringing new, and this is important, and with this I will finish, is bringing new technologies into the teaching of English. Now, the truth is that Latin America's experience with what we call Spanish TICs, new technologies, information and communication technologies applied to education, is not very successful. Okay. In part, it's because we focus too much on the technology and too little in the education. Okay, part of it was really distributing laptops. That has become a very popular approach. And without sufficient emphasis on really what is it that we use them for and how we use them. But the reality is that the technology is out there, and there is potential to leverage teachers with technology. Now, the most obvious one is actually using perhaps one of the simplest forms of technology, which is video and video connections. So a very good example of that is, I mentioned Uruguay earlier. So Plan Ceibal, which is essentially originally a one laptop per child program, got involved in English. And essentially what Uruguay didn't have enough English language teachers, and so what they've been doing now for a number of years is actually beaming teachers from other countries as far as the Philippines. Now, this is not, there's a local teacher in the classroom that is part of the scheme. Okay? And in fact, this is both a delivery model as well as a professional development model, because the teacher, the local teacher, is actually learning with the foreign teacher, teaching techniques, etc. So that's a basic example where you can actually use a little bit more technology, and that reduces the need for humans. And it's so it's a little bit of the robotization approach, but it doesn't stop there, right? The whole idea of using interactive methods through online for listening, for exercises as a way of complementing the more traditional methods, I think has a potential. And this is a very dynamic field. I know how many people have heard about Duolingo. It's an app that is actually getting very good results. And who knows? We cannot close our eyes to this, new developments, and it's something that I think needs to be integrated. So I really want to leave a few minutes for questions. So I will stop here. But essentially end with a call for action. On Thursday and Friday, it was a call for action to mostly the people that make these big decisions. But today is a call also for those of you that are or will be teaching. That the only way to sustain this effort that Chile has been making for now over a decade is really to push the frontier. Many of these things that need to happen at the grassroots. There are things that need to happen from the top, but a lot of what needs to happen that we discussed today really need to happen in the trenches. And without the commitment the open-mindedness and the innovation on the part of those of you that are in charge of teaching English. All those, big changes here at the top are not going to permeate down to what matters, which is whether children are indeed learning. So thank you very much. So thanks for the comment. We are an independent think tank, and the work that we do, the analysis we do, is not in any way influenced by who provides the funds. And that's a very well established and managed, that we will not accept orientations and from funders in terms of what we produce. So that's sort of the general response. Now, I appreciate, since that you may disagree with our findings, what I would suggest is that if you have different, we're always welcome the debate and alternative views. They have to be put on paper and show the data, and based on that, let the public decide who is right and who is wrong. What I don't think is proper is to question the robustness of an analysis based on the source of funds and without showing alternative data on the issue. So I welcome if there is an alternative report that looks, I'm not familiar at all with any other report that looks at English language learning across the region. And if there is one, I would welcome the chance to sit down and debate. And if shown that there is data that shows alternative interpretations, I'm always happy to correct and modify the conclusions. So, thank you.